Well, Ian Norton, what a great pleasure to be here with you today. And here we are, Respond Global Health Crisis Management Operations, and you are an expert in this field. Now, it's a great pleasure to speak with an expert, and let me tell you why. I found a little badge the other day on Facebook, and it said, I'm an expert in communicable diseases, qualified by Facebook. And I presume your qualifications are significantly higher than those with Facebook.
Well, I didn't get it on the back of a cornflakes packet, if you like.
I'm really pleased about that. And what's important about this is that it's amazing to speak with a real expert, because there's so many people saying so many weird things who are professed to be experts. So what we're going to do today is have a chat about your view, obviously, and your work in emergency health response, and particularly in relation to the cruise sector, which we're all passionate about. Now, you were head of the World Health Organization's emergency medical team in Geneva from 2014 to 2020, and you led the responses to things like Ebola, diphtheria, and measles outbreaks. I mean, that must have been hugely challenging. Tell me a little bit about that as a matter of interest.
Yeah, well, when I went into Geneva to help the WHO get this new program started, I had previously been working in Australia setting up the medical teams here, and when Australia sends a team to another country for Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, for example, I led that medical team there. WHO asked me to come and help out in Geneva, and it was more programmatic kind of area. It became very clear that they weren't operational in any way, and then West African Ebola hit.
Yes.
And so I was dragged in very early on, and then went to West Africa and stayed there for about 7 months to try and bring in medical teams, create the big field hospitals that you saw, eventually treat and stop the outbreak.
Wow.
But it was interesting, yes, that sort of juxtaposition of health bureaucrats meeting an operational guy, and it was. I'm sure that's what we'll get into around this.
Look, yeah, I've got the funny feeling that that's the sort of thing that might be sort of happening here. But just moving across into cruising, I mean, just talking about Ebola and stuff for a minute, and Africa for a second. These are amazing diseases, and are they ingrained in places like Africa? I mean, or they're controllable, or?
So, well, Ebola is quite interesting compared with COVID. It's one of those diseases where if you get it, you get symptoms very early on, and then gradually get more and more infective. So it is a manageable disease if you have the resources. Quite fun. We know a lot about it. It's been around for some time now. We've studied it for decades. Not like COVID. Again, it's a novel disease, and it's this issue. As we learn, we'll get better at fighting it. And if you can get people to isolate and quarantine, and also encourage them into the system, because in West Africa and in some other countries, and even rich countries like COVID, there's rumours, there's Facebook, and there's all sorts of social media that drive people away, or they're fearful. They see people in white suits and they're speaking a different language, both figuratively and literally. We didn't take an approach of looking at that from the point of view of a patient and saying, what would encourage me into the system so I can become part of the solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if you look at the situation with COVID at the moment in India, it's beyond belief at this point in time, but I'm sure we'll talk about that. But you're an expert. You advise several cruise lines on their health and safety, Coral Expeditions, who are operating currently, Ponant, who had that very interesting scenario in New Zealand, Aurora Expeditions, APT, MSC, and P&O Carnival. So some industry experts taking advice from a real industry expert in this field, which is amazing. You've been quoted as saying that you say cruise can now return safely with new health protocols, even before the vaccine program is completed. Tell me why you believe that.
So, currently we have several good examples of people operating cruises in a safe manner, here in Australia and also in Europe with MSC. And at this stage, we haven't managed to get full vaccination in crew or in passengers. And so it is possible to sail safely. Now, you can see vaccines as an added benefit. So when it comes along, of course, with open arms, we're going to receive that, and it'll just make it even more safe. But we shouldn't see vaccination as the point in time. We must wait beyond that till we start cruising. That's just false. We are cruising perfectly well right now, particularly in bubbles like Australia, where if we can get inside the safe the quarantine zones of Australia, where we have little or no communicable disease transmission in the community. Therefore, the risk on board is very much the same as risk on land, and therefore we can say in Australia it is safe to cruise right now, as long as you follow these mitigations and protocols, and then have response in the background.
Well, I suppose the question then is, why is the government not appearing to do anything. And I mean, I'm sure they are doing lots of things, and I'm sure CLIA are doing lots of things as well in the background, but there's very little information coming out. I think maybe the industry knows, or the cruise operators know, but the travel industry at large is extremely dependent on cruising, and they're desperate to sell cruising, and cruisers are desperate to go cruising. So why do you think the government's so quiet? Do you think they're scared or frightened?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. I mean, I'm privy to a lot of the discussions going on within industry, between clients and ourselves, and also with the government. And I must say there's a fantastic atmosphere amongst all those working groups of positive approach. There is an element of some health and other sectors not quite understanding cruising at all. It's a specific operational area. And in a way I'm helping, I hope, to translate public health into in both ways, sort of standing between going, I understand the public health world, I understand the operations of cruising now, and then you're translating and making sure we're not talking past but to each other. So that's been an interesting journey, but I do think that there are some positive things coming up. We're just a bit unfortunate that cruising has been lumped in with the other international border question. Now, we have got, call it Fortress Australia, or a safe area within Australia. We're very privileged really to have the lifestyle we have right now, and a lot of that is to do with the way we approached our borders. Now, how long is that sustainable in the future economically, we can discuss and debate, but I think that international travel quarantine approach will need to stay, especially as these new variants emerge. But unfortunately, cruises have been put inside that same sort of discussion. It's not really the same discussion at all we're having. There is a question of how to get a vessel through the quarantine border, get all the crew who are on board or fly in to join, quarantine safely, but from then on they should be considered part of Australia. And that message that we're talking about cruising inside Australian waters, or inside the bubble of Australia, if we're allowed to New Zealand back, that would be great. But it's just during this period staying within that bubble, it gets conflated with the international discussion all the time, which is not appropriate.
No. And do you think the government, I mean, it'd be unfair of me to ask you too much about that, because I know you're involved in the discussions, as you mentioned, but is the government heading towards this domestic cruising scenario, possibly Sydney cruises to nowhere, Melbourne cruises to nowhere, then maybe a couple of ports? I mean, you mentioned MSC, we're all Caribbean, and I can't remember the name of the other company, has been operating out of Singapore for several months now, and 150,000 plus people have cruised without incident. So the message is there quite clearly. So is the government heading towards this in some form, do you believe?
Certainly centrally, the federal government and the discussions we're having are very positive. I think we will get there. I wish it was faster, honestly. But there is the beauty of federation. We have a state and a federal discussion at the same time, and so in a way, one is not fearful of taking a step before the other, and so forth. I think in general they're understanding. Yes, there are protocols in place that will make cruising safe, and they understand that if we can sort out the quarantine of vessel and crew coming in and then remaining within that bubble from then on, of course, it makes common sense that the risk on land, it would be transferred to the risk on board that vessel for that bubble. But the big question here is, for how long will we wait until we hear back from the chief health officers of each state and territory? Now they, for a while, have they've become risk averse, I think, in general. And I can say this as a public health guy. I work in this area constantly. Their awareness or their approach to risk mitigation protocols has been a little bit disappointing from my point of view. And I'm saying this as a fellow clinician to my fellow clinical people. In a way, they're not quite understanding what the industry is doing and all these extra things that they put in place. If I was able to sit down with the chief health officer and explain line by line what we've actually done on each of these vessels, I think they'd quickly say, actually, this is far more than we do anywhere on land right now in any state.
Is there any possibility of doing that and getting them all on a vessel? I mean, I've spent a lot of time on cruise ships, and the sanitisation of ships, as you know, is extremely high. You know, whether we're at green level, yellow level, or red level. With red level, when we've got a norovirus outbreak or something like that, where the whole ship is practically filled with Virox or bacterial stuff. And it's cleaned constantly. Because again, I mean, like with norovirus isn't a cruise ship problem. Norovirus is a human being problem that's taken on board cruise ships, and then people don't sanitize. So hopefully we could all hope that the health officers might be taken by you on a ship. Who knows?
They keep on looking. They keep on commenting back to us that they talk about the Ruby or the Diamond and other vessels and say, "Oh, it's just going to be like that," and which is, I think, just unfair.
It's nonsense. Yeah,
it is. It's so long ago we knew nothing about COVID. As I was saying about Ebola, we've learned how to deal with it. Just like now in COVID, it's been a massive schooling for all of us over the last 16 months or so. And so, in a way, if we can get used to managing our lives on land here, we can absolutely manage the risk on board as well.
Well, that sounds very positive, I mean, from the governmental perspective. But if we look at the Northern Territory, and in the last 2 weeks, I've tried to have an interview with the Chief Health Officer in the Northern Territory, the Head of Northern Territory Tourism, the Health Minister, the Tourism Minister, and they've all rejected my requests. And that immediately makes you think they're hiding something. What is going on here? Because the initial decision of 100 combined crew and guests, total of 100 on a ship, as you've been quoted as saying, I mean, that's not sustainable, and there's very few ships that operate it. And it just didn't make any sense. And it said to me, they don't know what they're talking about. They don't understand cruising. So that situation is one that's ongoing, and you have clients who have ships going potentially to the Northern Territory. How do you think that will, I mean, they've got up to 150 now, which still doesn't help very much, but how do you think that will resolve itself?
Well, I think over time, if we keep on sending the documents and the information to this team up in the Northern Territory and explaining to them quietly that we have actually looked at the risk here. The risk is, I think, overstated in a way, and the mitigation and the testing that's going on beforehand is strong enough to mitigate the risk.
Yes.
Now, if your risk tolerance is absolutely zero, as in you won't tolerate any risk whatsoever, and then of course we all need to just stay at home and not leave the house for the next 2 years. That's not real life, nor is an appreciation of the economic loss that will happen in the Northern Territory for the add-on tourism trips that people do when they go on a cruise.
Mark McGowan in WA is rubbing his hands in glee because, of course, all these ships are going to operate out of Broome instead. And there are also ships that are planning to come into Australia via Darwin and Broome and so on. So they must be in a bit of limbo. So just talking about crew for a second, okay? Because the crew on, let's for example, P&O, Royal Caribbean, whatever, most of the ships in the Northern Territory, or some of the ships in the Northern Territory, are Australian registered and have Australian crew on board, okay? So let's leave those out of it for now because they're sort of very secure. Some of the other ships have crew from the Philippines, from Indonesia, wherever, possibly from India even. And then the P&O ships and Royal Caribbean ships, if they're operating here, they have crews from multiple countries. How do you deal with that situation? Okay, it's a bit like in the UK where all the guests on board the P&O ships are going to be operating shortly, and other ships it appears will need to be vaccinated, but the crew, it's impossible to get vaccinations in many of these countries. So how do you deal with that issue?
Well, there's a couple of options to look at crew vaccination. We are looking with some clients at how we can access vaccination in their home countries. Obviously, the supply is low at the moment. We must make sure that it's going to be a vaccine that's valid and that works. Make sure there's no counterfeit, and there is some counterfeit vaccine out there. So we've got to be careful about all those things and making sure that we have all the right health protocols in place. If we're going to get it at source, that would be fantastic, and it will just make access back into Australia here a little easier. We would still expect, of course, full quarantine for 2 weeks, either on board a vessel or on shore, whichever is manageable best.
So let's say, for example, a ship coming, say, from Asia somewhere, and coming into Australia on a world cruise, say, in December, January, or whatever, right? That ship would still have to quarantine for 14 days somewhere with all the crew, but no guests on board, probably? Or they could have guests.
Well, a world cruise will be more difficult. So at this stage, we're still only discussing a vessel arriving in to stay in Australian waters and cruise just in Australia. Otherwise, we're going to get into this issue of, just like other international borders, if you're just going to come to Australia for a short period and move on, I doubt there's going to be enough.
I mean, there are ships I've seen, who are proposing to come to Australia and then doing a circumnavigation of Australia and then leaving. So that's probably a little bit different.
That's a little bit further out, and that certainly hasn't been discussed as yet. I think that would be harder to justify in a way, but certainly cruising coming in going through all the protocols so effectively you can...
The 14 days.
Yeah, be in the same risk profile as the rest of Australia.
Yeah.
Then it's a very healthy discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Our friends over the ditch in New Zealand, okay, they've done a brilliant job as well, I think, in controlling COVID, and I'm sure you're the specialist, as I say, in this space. Do you see the potential of the bubble, the cruise bubble, when it gets going, okay, when the government actually decides with the states to operate cruises? Do you see that potentially that cruises could operate to New Zealand, so the bubble would extend to New Zealand?
Absolutely. I don't see any issue with that. And hopefully as things progress in the Pacific, we'll also find other countries get high rates of vaccination. There are some countries that have had 0 cases of COVID. So if we can establish cruising bubbles into the Pacific as well, the economic benefit from both sides will be fantastic.
Well, look, Ian, thank you very much for speaking with me today. I know you're extremely busy dealing with all your clients at the moment, which is great news for your business because it's good, positive stuff. But I think that speaking to an expert today has been critically important to me in my own mind in sorting things out. It's a very positive picture, it's a manageable picture, and I think between your work with your clients and hopefully with the federal government and some of the state governments, I would urge every state government to employ you now, okay, and that you should take their health officers on a ship to understand what a cruise ship is all about. They are extremely safe environments from an infectious perspective. And I don't want to go into the Ruby Princess scenario, but that was unfortunate, and there were people involved in that, that probably made the wrong decisions at the time. But that's in the past, as you say, and we know a lot more about COVID now, and it's a very different situation today. So thank you for your time, I really appreciate it, and thank you for your positive and scientific response. You weren't dealing with innuendo or supposition or, sort of uneducated views. You were giving us absolutely educated scientific facts, and I thank you for that.
My pleasure, John.